Welcome to Playbook for October. For those of you who haven't been to one, I think Mike's going to roll a video of kind of what Playbook has been historically. Traditionally, it's been an in-person event. We've typically run in two cities, Vancouver and Toronto. Usually a couple hundred people in attendance, speakers from all over North America. And we like to bring speakers that nobody has seen before, that come from all over North America. And so now, as that we're in COVID, we're of course doing a whole different approach. We're going to a shorter format, typically 60 to 90 minutes. And actually, it's more popular than ever. We're doing it every month. This one, I think we had about 440 people signed up, which is larger than we ever had at one of our in-person events. And of course, hundreds will watch after the fact as well. Our statistics are over 90% of you will stay and watch all of the presentations, which is really gratifying. That obviously we're hitting a nerve, providing high value content for you. And arguably this approach is actually having more impact than our in-person events ever did. So we're really delighted by that. You'll notice, as a point of logistics in your tool here, there's a Q&A tab to your right. So if you have any questions you want to ask our speakers, then just go ahead and enter your questions in there, and we'll get to them right after. After each presentation, we'll have a couple questions, and then at the end, we'll have a sort of an open Q&A session for any sort of burning issues. There's also a handouts tab if you're interested in a white paper that we produced at StarFish based on data. Then you go ahead and look in the handout section. You can download that if you want, if you wish. So today's topic is the true cost of developing a medical device. This is actually obviously a super hot topic, and more broadly thought of, it's actually what's the true cost of developing a medical device company? Because there's a lot of bad information around on that, and we find as we talk to people there's often a lot of confusion about that. So we're lucky this time. We've got some remarkable speakers who all spent a lot of time looking at actual data. You know, there was this W. Edwards Deming said, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." So that is that's our philosophy as well. We really want to base it on real information. For those of you who don't know who Deming was, he was really the godfather of the continuous improvement and statistical process control movement, which ultimately led to the lean approach to business. And I'll tell you why that's relevant in a sec. But let me give you a little bit of context about StarFish. Why do we do this? So we're a product development services company focused only in medical devices and medical biotech devices. We've been doing this for 21 years. So we're one of the older ones. We have 130 staff. I don't even know, it might be 150. So we're one of the larger ones in North America. We're also founder owned, which is unusual in our space. Things that we're known for is innovation, for deep technical expertise, and also for our business focus on getting the product right. So that which gets us back to Deming and the latest incarnation of that philosophy is really the lean startup journey. So we want to be partners for lean startup type companies, and our Pathfinder process, which is really focused on that. We're very interested in having the companies exit well, founders do well, and avoid expensive missteps. So enough about all that. We also have manufacturing, NPI, new product introduction services. So here's the types of clients that we would work with. You may recognize some of these because they're larger corporates, and there's a lot of startups in here. For example, Novadac on the bottom left was one of our early clients. And they actually were able to exit to Stryker for over $700 million. So it was a very good narrative for them. And these are the sort of things that the products that we would work on would look like. You can sort of tell by looking. There's a very high technology aspect to these things. And we also care a lot about the product to market fit and the human factors, industrial design. That one in the middle, those two little tiny things, are actually ingestible robotic capsules, and they have an onboard assay platform. So, and based on that innovation we did for them, they were able to raise over $100 million. So, anyway, that's enough about us. So today we got three really interesting, strong speakers for you, and I'll introduce each of them in turn. And to start with, we have Mark Durlick. He's the Director of Program Design at StarFish Medical. He has 20 years of medical device or product development experience, mostly medical. At StarFish, he used to manage our mechanical engineering group, but he's actually a very big picture thinker, and he's now focused on helping our prospective clients figure out the most productive approach to be able to move through our organization. And he's also the author of the white paper that he'll be sharing with you, and which you can download from the handout section. I'll pass over to Mark.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Scott. And as Scott alluded to, what we're talking about here is medical device development costs and some of the tools and sources to determine and project. So for those of you that have read the white paper, there's going to be some new content and information contained within it. I'd like to just start briefly with a poll, and Mike, if you could bring that up. And that question is what the average amount of funding that companies raise for an FDA Class 2 medical device to a regulatory clearance point. And then in complement, what the associated product development costs are that are tied within it. So you have about a couple of minutes to kind of step through that, and we'll keep on going in the interim. In terms of an agenda, this presentation is really focused on two items. One of them is, again, what those total costs are, and then also some tips and tools to try to figure out how far along that journey you actually are. These are kind of holistic things and built from data. So I'll briefly talk about where some of the data that's conveyed in here comes from. I developed a white paper that's available again for download in here. I'm going to summarize that in 2 slides subsequent to this for those that haven't read it. But I wrote this for 3 reasons. One of them was to help others, meaning, if you're trying to get into this and you're trying to figure out what the general landscape of costs are, it's a pretty good foundation built on some information that was available. The other one was satisfying my own curiosity. I've worked at StarFish for 10 years, and I wanted to ensure and just do a reality check on what my nomenclature and costs were relative to the larger industry to make sure that those things align. And then the third point was to save people time. So sometimes that's myself in early conversations, and sometimes that's prospective people that have their hearts in the right place, but perhaps aren't thinking about the big picture of what the actual costs are going to be. Just to briefly talk about the white paper again in 2 slides, the data that's contained within it comes from 3 primary sources. The first one is the Make-Hour report, came out about 10 years ago, and is focused on 200 medical technology companies. And there was an extensive amount of review and investigation that went along with this, and as well as independently audited by PricewaterhouseCoopers, and gives a great breadth of information, including timelines and device categorizations. Second point of reference for the meta-analysis was a paper that was written on commercialization of microfluidic point-of-care diagnostic devices, some of which are medical, some of which are in vitro diagnostics, some of which are lab-based equipment. And then the third point was some independent thought. So some analysis that I completed with some insights to various companies that I had a narrative with or for, and then public sources by which those funding agencies and mechanisms were provided. So Crunchbase is one of the great tools that's available there. So the polling answer comes here. I'm not going to read all the content in here. I will highlight that product development costs are not inclusive of the whole journey, the whole funding amounts. And so the focus of product development costs are those items listed on the left. For the whole journey, what the costs that are projected in the white paper and throughout this presentation are not exclusive of some of the early research and science that would happen in universities. And it's also not necessarily inclusive, though I will talk briefly to it, of the manufacturing and scale up, procurement, hiring sales force elements beyond device clearance. An additional element in here is intellectual property, and I'll just flag that Peter Sleeman, who I believe is attending the webinar, has written a book on this. It's available on Amazon. He'll offer a discount, as well as there's some collateral that he has available in the form of a white paper. No affiliation here, but somebody that took initiative to try to provide insight for medical devices and what the intellectual property costs are. So if you're interested in that, leave that reference with you. So the polling question, here's the answer. in general, from the sources that I conveyed there before, the costs to develop a medical device, total funding amounts raised, 30 million. And then the development costs are somewhere in the range of around $2 to $5 million. And so I don't see the polling answers here, but for those that got it right, congratulations. For those that are curious on where those dollar amounts come from, I invite you to, again, look at the white paper and kind of fill in some blanks here that aren't contained within this presentation. So in some of the early conversations and draft versions of that white paper, I sent it out to some prospective clients and got some interesting responses. Some people were just basically stating, oh my goodness, I think this is crazy, I have to rethink this. Some people were just stating, I've already spent $2 million, so that means I'm pretty much done. And then there was a larger majority of the people that interfaced with this that sort of said, I already know this, but I'd still really like to have a ballpark estimate and try to work through some of the details. Not going to talk about that group of people necessarily, but interestingly, some of them have taken that information and spun out companies and developed a lot of great collateral and development on the way. So the rest of this presentation is going to talk about how to figure out what your actual journey should cost, and then subsequent to that, what are some of the tools to try to determine where you are along that journey. And so that's a two-step process that we're going to talk through in the remaining slides. The first bullet point here, or step rather, in the approach is try to figure out what your scale is. On the left-hand side, I've shown a very simple medical device, class 1 tongue depressor. And on the right-hand side, I've shown a tricorder. For those of you that are Star Trek fans, perhaps this is more interesting. And anybody that wants to develop one, there's also an X Prize out there. You can get yourself $10 million. I'm going to jump straight into a case example and talk about some of the tools that may be useful to help you define what that journey looks like. And so this is a case example of tear labs. It's a device that sips a small amount of tear from your eye and quantifies the osmolarity of it as an indicator for dry eye disease. And the journey for them from a development cost perspective to a cleared device was $10 million. There's some great references that kind of give some indications for that. And then I went through and looked at what the technical challenges were, some of the form development that would be required, the graphical user interface, tried to break this down into some logical chunks and provide a ballpark for what the estimated development costs would be for something like this, and ballpark this somewhere around $3 million in terms of development costs. Some interesting facts, sort of in looking back at Tier Labs now. 10 million was what it took them to get their cleared device, and the additional funding to get to them to date has been $54.6 million. That's inclusive of things like manufacturing scale up. It's inclusive of hiring a sales team, keeping the lights on, and then there will be profit that will also be realized throughout that time period. And then recently they exited for 25 million. So if you're trying to define the total development costs, one initial point to try to ensure that we're thinking about things in the same way is to try to define what your exit point is. That can be to regulatory clearance, as highlighted in the middle and conveyed in the data that's contained here. But sometimes people aren't interested in the whole journey and want to develop intellectual property. Additionally, if you're trying to come out to a commercial sales strategy, there's also some differences in terms of what those costs are. To kind of ballpark some of these things, intellectual property, just getting there, is probably about 1/10 the development costs relative to a regulatory cleared device, maybe even less, depending on where you're at. And then for commercial sales, it's probably about a 5 or 10x over a regulatory clearance endpoint. Additional tips here in trying to define some of these scales is try to find people that have done this before. I know this is fairly obvious, but there are some similar companies that will have done something like what you are thinking of in the past. And so finding those and trying to engage with some of the former members of that company, and maybe even hiring some of them to your board, makes a lot of sense. Just from available public information, you can figure out things about the regulatory journey, perhaps some of the technical gotchas in the papers that would be on PubMed or similar, and then also some insights in terms of the required funding that their journey took. So it's another great reference that allows you to provide some insights into those without building up a really detailed bottoms-up program plan. So, with the general understanding of what the costs are for developing medical device is obviously some of the challenging conversations from companies that I get involved in is trying to determine where they are without calling the baby ugly. On the left-hand side, we see a very incomplete medical device, perhaps not even one medical device, and on the right-hand side, we see something very, very complete. And so there's a few different tools that I wanted to talk about in terms of trying to calibrate where you are on that scale for your completed device development. One of them, fairly obvious, is going to be technology readiness levels. These are a scale that was defined by NASA back in the day to try to determine how ready the device is to being sent up into outer space. It's been modified a whole bunch of different ways. I found this as a useful reference points to kind of convey the detailed sequences going from academia through to industry. In terms of this as a tool for defining where you are in the process, it's not great, primarily because a majority of the work that happens in medical device development is in around the TRL 5 to 6. Maybe that extends into 4 and 7 and beyond, but to define the costs to get from sort of a early company spin out of academia all the way through to a regulatory clear device, a majority of that's going to be TRL 5 and 6. The point that I did want to also accentuate on this point is that if there are elements of your device that haven't been proven on a fundamental research perspective, the framework of costing that's laid out within this presentation may not necessarily be appropriate. An additional tool that I like to use and think about when trying to define what the remaining journey looks like is to place it within a product development design process. The one that I'm showing up here is StarFish Medicals, and it lists off the primary criteria by which we're going to be looking at things like regulatory compliance, human factors and usability, the technology development. Do you understand how the device is going to be fabricated? These are all things that are going to inform how much remaining development costs will reside. And an additional tool that kind of lays in with this is the gate review processes. These are listed up down at the bottom, where we collect a group of people, including companies that we may be engaging with, to have an honest conversation about where remaining technical risks are and what outstanding activities would necessarily be required in order to go through to the next gates. An alternative tool, there's two more here, is a design history file assessment. What is a design history file? It's the compilation of documents that is required to provide as a submission to the regulatory authorities. In the FDA guys, that's a design history file. For other people, they may call it a technical file. And it constitutes a whole series of documents. The emphasis that I would put on this is that it's actually a design tool. An anecdote of a company that we've had some experiences with is they selected an alternative design partner that didn't have medical device experience, spent about a year developing out a product, and then started thinking about the risk analysis, at which time this company pulled the product away from this consulting firm and handed it over to StarFish. And going through the process of risk analysis highlighted a whole lot of pretty large design changes that were necessary in order to have this device be safe and effective for its use environment. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is really the design history file is a tool that can also provide you with insights as to where your design is. It's okay if you don't have one, but it's a metric that helps define, again, where you are and what the remaining journey for the device may be. Another tool that we often use is try to break down the architecture associated with the device. This is a bit of a fictitious one, where there's an enclosure with some electronics and sensors that interface with the patient. Those electronics beam it out to a cloud. On the cloud, there's some algorithms. Those algorithms process the data and send it to a PC software that's viewed by a clinician in a clinic environment. So holistically, who's responsible for what, and what are the big remaining unknowns with this project? This is a quick tool that helps to differentiate roles and responsibilities, and also provide some insight as to, again, what the architecture of the device is. And there may be some levels of uncertainty in terms of how the cloud may interface associated with the various pieces here. And those are things that would want to be addressed before defining what the remaining journey looks like. In terms of the final tool here, which is then breaking down in a little bit more detail, involving some technical assessments on the various components within the architecture to define things like the enclosure. Is it good and functional? Probably. Signal to noise ratios perhaps are insufficient, and maybe the cloud requirements are not defined, but the algorithms are good. So again, just kind of drilling down a little bit further at a high level to try to determine where the areas of focus are and where technical uncertainties reside to finish out the design and development activities. So this leads me to a final case example here where I took the opportunity to go and find a device design that exists on the web. This is an open source DIY Holter monitor with an integrated EKG and motion sensing device, and just went through the process of trying to define where this device exists on the landscape of medical device development and launch. So functional prototype, this person had a heart defect and was curious about quantifying his own EKG, didn't want to go buy a Holter monitor, and then hacked one together. Probably spent more time and money doing so than just buying one, but nonetheless, it was a useful and interesting project that I'm using as this case example. So stepping through the tools that we just talked through in terms of technology readiness levels, EKG, very well known, functional prototype that's been used on a person, perhaps not through IRB approval, leads me to say that the technology readiness levels here are very high, but perhaps the phase of development with reference to StarFish's design process is actually pretty low. And the majority of the contributions to that is going to be associated with the fact that no risk analysis has been completed in terms of human factors and usability, not 100% sure, which leads me to say that the architecture within this is fairly good, but the technology or technical flags that would be required to be resolved may be things like 60601 compliance. So that's the electrical safety standard that needs to be complied to for medical devices. And one of them would be electromagnetic immunity and or ESD shocks. There's exposed parts here. This thing is going to fail those standards and it's going to require some amounts of redesign. Not a lot, but some. Additionally, I didn't know how this actually mounted onto somebody. And so the usability flag here is kind of an interesting one in that we'd want to try to figure out how this is going to connect. Finally, some of the assumptions here built in are included. And I sort of thought that in terms of how much development value is conveyed, $150,000. For those of you that are participatory, here's a free $150,000 of engineering. Feel free to use so. And then have a capture of what I thought relative to other companies that have sort of done similar costs and devices, what those development costs are going to be. It's about $7 million I would anticipate from a total raise based on historical information. And then about $750,000 of total development would be remaining. So those are a built-up case example. I did find another company here, but just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through the details of this. Somebody's done this. You can buy it on Amazon. And so there's some interesting data associated with how much it costs them that's included within this presentation. Yeah, so it's very interesting. Hopefully, this provides you with a little bit of insight and some grounding in terms of what the general costs would be. I'll put a quote out here from Albert Einstein: is the only source of knowledge is experience. Often doing these things over and over again, and providing some insights based on a library of different programs and projects is a useful place to start. And hopefully you find the tools and techniques and data that's contained within here useful in doing so. I also wanted to acknowledge that every company has a unique set of business and technology and regulatory needs. And so if you do find this interesting and want to develop it out a little further, we'd be happy to have a chat to try to determine where you fit in within those landscapes. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I appreciate and welcome any questions that may pop up.
Hello. Okay, so we have over 300 people watching, so there's a couple questions for you, Mark. So one, so this company example, Tier Labs spent $54 million and they sold their whole company after all that for $25 million. Would you consider that to be a good outcome?
I think the answer to that is obviously no. And I don't have all the dynamics and details about what the original owners had and maintained as their equity. You know, one of our goals here at StarFish is to see companies successful, and that involves thinking about what the next logical valuation milestone would be necessarily. And so maybe the owners exited when they raised 15 million. I don't know the answer to some of those, but clearly when you put in 50 million and get 25 out, that's a pretty terrible story to have to say.
There you go. So next question, and this will be our last question for this round. What are the best ways for physicians interested in working on or in the medical device industry to advance their non-clinical careers?
Their non-clinical careers. I think you should get into medical device design. It's probably one thing to state. Assuming that it is medical device design related, you know, understanding your market, understanding what problem you're trying to solve from a patient perspective are the seeds of successful medical devices. And then I think that's probably the first and easiest statement to make. Extending that beyond, you know, it depends on what your regulatory and or financial means are to develop out things further. Great.
Okay, that's our questions for Mark. For those of you who are interested in Mark's slides, you can, I believe his email is on the, was on the previous slide. Or you can just connect with StarFish or ask in the chat that you'd like to have the slides, and we'll connect you to Mark. And that's true of the other speakers. They'd all like to control where their slides go, but we're going to pass along the inquiries. So there we go. Yes. We're going live with Peter.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Scott, for hosting. You know, this is a really very timely topic. We get into this conversation a lot with entrepreneurs, and it often defines, you know, whether it is in fact a venture opportunity or not a venture opportunity in terms of the capital that's going to be required, and the kind of not just on the development side of the equation, but really on the scaling the business side of the equation. And obviously, I think as you already heard Mark talk a little bit about, it's the scaling after the development that typically takes far more capital than the actual development side. But I'm going to do a couple of introductory slides on who we are, some of our experience in the space, and then I'll jump into some of the data that we're going to talk about today. So we're really in the business of building transformative, companies. We do that on both sides of the equation: medical technology companies and therapeutic companies. On the med tech side, the biggest company that we built is probably a company called Mako Surgical that was acquired by Stryker for $1.7 billion about 6 or 7 years ago, and that's now really the heart of the Stryker knee and hip surgical platform, widely available now throughout North America and in fact the world. We have 6 partners, mostly located in Canada, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal. Our team's got about 27 years on average per person. We've been investing together for over 15 years. We've deployed now about $500 million across really 3 or 4 different business cycles. more than 100 companies backed in our portfolio. And then when you translate that through to really what's the impact of those companies have now brought more than 58 FDA-approved products to market. Those products touch about 1 billion lives. Those companies have now generated cumulative revenues either on their own or as a function of being acquired and then in the hands of their acquisitors of about $70 billion of revenues. And then we are the first venture private equity firm in Canada to take part of our carry, which is part of our profit on our investments, and donate it to leading healthcare foundations across the country. And we did it from a philanthropic point of view first, but then it's really been quite accretive in terms of building and deepening our relationships with many of these leading institutions around the world. Sorry, guys, the slides are jumping around to the point where I can't control them as easily. There it is. Okay. In terms of momentum, I just wanted to give you a sense. I know everyone talks about COVID-19 and what's gone on with that, but it's really had very little impact on our business and had really only modest impact on our companies. Most of our companies obviously had to do a reset in March and April, but as I can admit, many of those companies have extremely strongly since then. We've done 7 new investments in the last 15 months. And just interestingly, it's not often like this, but in fact, all 7 of those companies are Canadian companies. And at the same time, we've generated 5 exits across our portfolio. Those exits have generated over $200 million for our limited partners on $36 million of invested capital. And what makes us really proud is that 3 of those companies, Readiness, Zymeworks, and Forbius, are all Canadian foundation companies, and all have built substantive businesses here in Canada and now around the world. We have a pretty good exposure to the medtech space. On the left, you see some of the companies that we've sold. On the right, you see some of the companies that are already in the market and commercial. And then below, we have a portfolio of companies that are in development. BardyDX actually should be a company up on the commercialization side. And maybe Mark, I'd say, that guy who's looking to do that DIY project in Holter monitors, he probably wants to not do that. Bardy is in fact a single lead monitor that replaces all Holter monitors. The company's gone from $4 million in revenues when we invested 18 months ago to $35 million in revenues this year. It's one of the fastest growing companies in the sector. Competes against a company known as iRhythm, but they've added more than 120 new customers really since the beginning of COVID-19. So fantastic medical device story that's scaling incredibly quickly. So let's get into it. And again, with both Ram and Mark talking about the real data around some of this, I wanted to take a slightly different view and give you context around where medtech and in particular devices sit within the entire VC funding ecosystem, and then talk about the returns really from VC-backed device companies as opposed to really the broader ecosystem. And I will give some of the broader ecosystem data. I love the Silicon Valley Bank guys' research, and if you're interested in some of this stuff, they publish quarterly reports. They're great. Also agree with Mark, Crunchbase, fantastic source. But the Silicon Valley guys bank over 50% of the med device guys in the US. And so they get a lot of proprietary data that's not broadly available. And in fact, we share proprietary data with them on a no-name basis. So we know their data is pretty good, and we like to use it. So just again, to contextualize, device has been about 15 to 16% of the overall VC market really for the last 3 or 4 years. In terms of where the capital is really going in our space on the device side, it's really to cardiovascular, surgical, neurology, orthopedic, and vascular. And again, that's been pretty consistent over the last couple of years. One of the takeaways I want you to take from this slide is if you look at the number of companies funded between 2017 and 2019, that number is about 750 companies. And so I want you to think about that many companies funded, maybe not quite that many companies, maybe it's about 600 companies, maybe multiple rounds, but think about 600 companies when we talk about sort of exits and other realities in the market. So this is really the M&A and IPO data. And now Silicon Valley tends to only report on transactions where the exit value included a $50 million upfront on an M&A, or the IPO is what we would call a substantive IPO. So they don't cover the whole landscape of every little exit in their data, but they're really focused on VC-backed major transactions. And what's interesting about this, we just talked about 600 companies getting funded in a 3-year window. If you look at the exit data in that 3-year window, it's only about 70 companies. So it's only about 10% of companies getting an exit, despite that heavy funding level. And we'll talk about what what the consequences of that are as you get a little bit further in. So here's a little bit more of a breakdown in terms of kind of what's the behavior look like over the last 5 or 6 years. 2019 was a massive year in terms of exit values, but that was really completely skewed by one deal, the Oris transaction, with Oris being acquired by J&J for $5.8 billion, of which $3.4 billion was upfront. So if you take that out of the data, in fact, what you see is that total exit values really over the last 6 or 7 years have not changed very much at all. It's really been quite steady at 7 million. What has been a little bit more encouraging is a little bit of a resurgence in the IPO market, both in terms of raw numbers, although still not great. 8 is not a great number. And if you compare that to IPOs in the therapeutics or pharma space, already this year to date, we've had 66 IPOs in the therapeutic space. So again, it dwarfs the device side, but encouraging in terms of both the pre-money valuation, obviously a significant rise, much like what we've seen in the therapeutic side, and then the median value that's been raised has also gone up quite nicely. So some positive trends, but again, still not as deep as we're seeing on the therapeutic side. And then I like this slide because when we get a deck from somebody, they always include that one company in their space as a proxy for really what can happen for them. And I think Mark said this, and I think it's the greatest advice on the planet, which is look at what other guys have done and look at how much capital they've actually raised. And so what we'll often see in decks, and I'll use any one of these examples, is that people use these as a proxy and say, hey, look, if we do our job, we can exit just like Oris did for $5 billion. And what people rarely do is actually look at how much capital these companies have raised. And so these are the companies that are considered the best of the best. These are companies that are on a pathway to a significant liquidity event, either through an IPO or an M&A. And the average of this group in terms of total capital raised is $329 million US. So just want to share that perspective so that when you're talking about comps, make sure your comps are truly your comps and not just the single best company that ever existed in your space in the entire lifetime of the industry. This was, I think, one of the questions that Scott just got. What's the difference between really a 510K and a PMA? This is some data that we pulled from the FDA, and it actually reconciles very, very closely with our own data from our own companies. I looked at and measured the actual spends in each of our companies over the last 10 years. And again, our data would be very, very consistent with this. 510K companies, somewhere in that 30 million-ish range, while PMA companies, 3 times higher than that original data set. And then I took another look at how we could come to this data based again on the Silicon Valley Bank data and looked at exits and the amount of capital raised prior to an exit. And what's really interesting, that's a pretty consistent number, whether it was a 510K or a PMA, really a range from 40 to 52 or $51 million. Again, what you see is that the de novo 510K and the PMA M&As really drive higher multiples and higher exit values and shorter time frames. And again, that bottom number is an important one to note, because it's not just about how much capital it costs you to get there, it's about how much time. And obviously capital and time are intricately linked. The longer it takes you to sell, the more capital you're going to require to keep building your company to an inflection point in value. Here's another look, at that data again, trying to parse out how much and what kind of returns. And again, just this is private M&A by stage. And what's important here is these are only companies where the upfront payment was more than $50 million. So you can see again that the numbers are relatively low, only 16 exits in 2019. And in fact, the upfront on those exits was only 115, even with Oris in that data. And remember, the Oris upfront was 3.5 billion. So without Oris, that number, really does get meaningfully smaller. So relatively consistent behavior, relatively consistent numbers, a little bit of weakness perhaps in the last couple of years in terms of return. And then really the challenge in building most med device companies today is that you have to build a commercial company. And of these companies, 75% were commercial in the US by the time that they were acquired. This really goes to the question that was asked at the beginning, and I'm going to just remind you here. If you look at these numbers, if you go back, it suggests that these are the kind of multiples you might have. These are the kind of exit values in that range. And this is what everyone gets excited about. But then when you look at the median data, it's quite a different story. And this is all commerce data. So if you look at that mean number of 200, which was on the slides that we saw before, the median number is much lower, 18 million, down, a couple of years earlier, down to 32. And we just heard a story about Tier Labs, having acquired or raised 54 million and then being sold for 25 million. So unfortunately, this is one of the challenges in the space. And then what that translates through to is this, which is data from Cambridge Associates. They do a pool of all first round fundings by venture capitalists for all device companies and all therapeutics companies. And then they look at the returns data for those companies across the pools over time. And the challenge in the med device space is because of this growing costs to get to value and to get to exit. In fact, the med devices space has really only had 1 year when its IRR was superior to the therapeutic space. And in fact, on average, the therapeutics companies have generated a 22% higher or almost 23% higher rate of return. So that's been the challenge in terms of capital allocation. And it really speaks to, I think, some of the challenges in the industry going forward in terms of how we figure out how we build these companies, how we adopt these technologies, how I think a country like Canada thinks about procurement and adoption, because we haven't done that really proactively, and how we can enable our companies to scale more quickly and more capital efficiently, so that in fact this disconnect does not continue in the marketplace. So Scott, those are my high level slides. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, let me just get my camera on here. Great. Well, there's a couple of great questions here for you. So, as you, not surprisingly, and then we'll get to more questions after that. But so from Adi M, we have, what about the development cost for a platform technology with multiple medical device products? How do you think about that as a venture capitalist?
Yeah, it's a great question. Very few medical devices are actually platforms. It's very rare, in fact, for us to find a medical device company that we would think of as a platform. And in our experience, I don't really think, Mako is probably the one company that we backed as a platform company, because it could do more than condylar knee, and now they're obviously doing hip. But that company, we sold it for 1.7 billion to Stryker. And we sold it when it had just over 100 million in revenues, but it cost 400 million to build that company to that point. So still, even then, only a 4x on capital deployed. So I think the answer is, if it's truly a platform, it's going to be more expensive to build, and you're still going to have to go through and validate probably in the marketplace, and that's going to be a costly process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that validation part, that's the tricky part. So one question, if we could, your next question before we move on to Ram, if we'd like to dig a little deeper into more specific verticals or niches, where would you get information like that?
Yeah, look, so I would, again, I think Crunchbase, I think Silicon Valley Bank have great data if you're talking about just trying to understand, what it's costing to build companies in these different areas. Go to the public company filings. Public company filings are an incredible source of data. So I think, Scott, you referenced Novadac earlier. It was a $700 million plus acquisition. Again, even that company, 400 million, I think 340 million to build that company. So 2x on capital deployed. Profound, 196 million in the ground. One of our companies in our portfolio, Opsens, 54 million in the ground. Public companies are a fantastic source of data. It's very detailed. You can see what they spent their money on and why. Talking to VCs and looking at VC-funded companies, I think, is a tremendous source of data. All of us are pretty disciplined about collecting that data and making sure we understand it, because when we're having conversations with you and entrepreneurs about what it takes, this is one of the big topics. We walk away from a lot of deals because of the disconnect between what the entrepreneur thinks the company will exit for and our own view on what experience and what lots of data tells us the probability of that exit is likely to be.
Great, good information. So we'll have more Q&A after the next speaker, and now we're ready to go to Ram. So Ram Rao is a very interesting serial medical device entrepreneur from Southern California. Interestingly enough, today we had Ram was due to fire scares in Southern California, had to sleep in a hotel last night. And meanwhile, Peter Vandervelden is watching snow happen in Toronto. So we got both extremes going on today. So Ram is a serial entrepreneur with 25 years of experience in ophthalmic devices, as well as a variety of other experiences. He's the chair of 2C Technologies, which is an ophthalmic pharma company with a medical device aspect. He's the founder of AcuFocus, which is being rolled out worldwide. He was the founder of Tomei, which really created the whole corneal topography imaging system that's now used worldwide as a standard of care for all cataract and refractive surgeries. He's the COO of, or was the COO of Vitreoretinal Technologies. He was the president of the ophthalmic group of Premier Lasers, as well as various executive roles at BioRed Labs. So he has tremendous credibility that he brings to us today. You could turn your camera on.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk about some of my trials and tribulations, mostly. And so I just started saying that, I started Lensgen about 7 years ago. And this is an ophthalmology space. It's a class 3 device. It's a unique kind of a lens, a breakthrough technology, essentially. And what indication it addresses is normally when we are all born with this autofocus mechanism that brain and eye coordinate, and so that we can see 20 meters away something pretty clearly, 6 meters very clearly, and also our iPhones. And our eye is basically adjusting and doing an autofocus, and that is called accommodation. And the way it happens is the brain sends a signal to the eye that actually puts a tiny force on the lens, and the lens changes shape. And by lens changing the shape, you can change the focal point. This all happens automatically. Only humans and primates have this in the entire animal world. And however, when we reach the age of around 40, 45, our lens starts to become very rigid. And so it cannot respond to the signals coming in from the brain and the muscles in the eye. And so we cannot accommodate. We gradually lose that, and we need reading glasses. And there hasn't been an effective solution for this problem, a surgical permanent solution for this problem over the last 40 years. People have been trying to replace the lens with another lens that works as well as the natural lens. Nothing has worked. And then people have gone to some fancy optics, lenses based around multifocal optics, etc. And they all have compromises. So we set out to start 7 years ago an effective solution, which is more or less replaces what we lost when we reach the age of 40. So it's a biomimetic, and it works with the eye and the neurological system, and is less intrusive than any other technologies. So that's just a background, because as we go through this presentation, I'm going to be talking related to my journey a little bit more. And so I wanted this presentation not to be encyclopedic or Wikipedic, if there is such a word, but it's more focused on concepts and what the components of cost are, and it'll give you more insights than anything else. And mostly this is really relevant for the entrepreneurs. And so I look at a medical device development process as essentially 3 steps or 3 phases. The first phase I call innovation. And this is where you have a novel idea or a breakthrough idea, and you take that concept, and then you do a lot of market research, and then you do some fundamental research into the science of that technology. and then you have a concept for the product, and then you go through research and development, R&D process. This is the area where you need a company like StarFish to help you through this process, because they do this process very, very well. And this is the most important part, because this is where the light bulb goes on and you're putting a shape to the product. The second phase is safety phase. I mean, this is where you're going to make sure that the product actually works in a real environment it is intended for. You make sure that it is safe over a long period of time. You make sure that it applies well to the intended purpose. And this is an important phase. And the last phase is now that you have done all this work here, this is another phase where StarFish can help you too. And then you go to the next phase, which is regulatory path. And now you've got to convince somebody else that this actually does what you intended to do and what the market wants, and it is safe over a long period of time. And the last phase, of course, I didn't talk about here, is the commercialization. And that's probably a subject for another discussion. So I'm going to go through these three phases. And the first thing to realize here is these phases are iterative within themselves, and they are iterative overall as well between the phases. Now, one of the insights, one of the goals of any entrepreneur into the medical device development is you want to iterate as much as you can in a single phase and not through the phases, because that's what makes it extremely expensive. And when you hand over from phase 1 to phase 2, you've done enough homework, enough testing, enough verification, enough validation, that you're not going to come back to the phase 1 again. And the more you can do that, the better it is. The lower is the cost, and the faster is the time to market. And so, and obviously, innovation phase is the most creative, most interesting. A lot of us who are come from a technical background, we love this phase, and this is where we do important discoveries, and we solve some tough problems, and we pat ourselves on our back. But unfortunately, investors don't. This is just one of the smallest phases. And so that we have to keep in mind. And also when you're presenting your ideas to the investors, don't talk too much about what are the difficult problems you solved, as much as, what are the important milestones in the overall scheme of things you achieved. And so these are, on this, I'm not going to read through these particular phases. And we know that, but one thing I want to emphasize before we go to the next one, we're going to come back and revisit some of these things again. The concept of MVP. What is the minimum viable product? And you have a very clear understanding of this before you really go into next phase or within this phase. This is the product that you intend to market. Somebody intends to buy this product for a certain price you have in mind. And that's where the value creation for the company is. And if it is, you define what that MVP is, and don't go to the next phase unless you're very, very, very close to that one. And this is where a lot of mistakes are done. And then the costs keep building up because you have to come back or go back to the drawing board again. So you want to avoid that as much as possible. So what I've done in my case of this lens design is very innovative. Most of the lenses that are implanted in the eye are solid lenses. Ours is a fluid lens. It's one of the first fluid lenses in the marketplace. And there's no knowledge base at all on how to build a fluid lens, how to test a fluid lens, and et cetera, et cetera. And so we had to be absolutely sure that we have the right stuff before go to the next stage. So we did a lot of work on in silico by modeling. We went to Stanford University to get the right kind of a modeling. And then we did prototype only when we optimized in modeling. And sometimes we can do this, sometimes we cannot do that. And then when we prototyped, we tested on the bench, and StarFish helped us build a unique simulator that works almost like an eye. And we tested hundreds of lenses. And when we were getting the data, we liked it. And that's when we said, okay, we can move on to the next phase, which is the safety phase. And in this, you want to make sure the product is biocompatible, because ours is a class 3, we are implanting in the human eye. And then for that, we do a lot of animal testing to make sure before we go to human trials outside of the United States, and the product is safe. And then we go through a series of pilot trials at multiple sites with multiple investigators. And then we continue to optimize the design from a user's point of view. Is this the easiest way for adoption for the surgeons, etc.? And some of these steps that in green here may not be required for a 510K device, but in some cases they do different kind of clinical trials. But you do this, and we implanted these eyes in over 110 eyes, and got a lot of good data. And we collected this data over 5 years. We wanted to make sure device is really stable over a long period of time before we go into the next phase. And at the same time, constant theme behind all the is, you're improving your manufacturability of the product. You're also creating a quality file. The last phase is the regulatory phase. This is where it's more driven by outside agencies, less driven by you. And so first you have to freeze the design. After we freeze the design, and we went and did one more, a definitive clinical trial outside of the United States without changing anything. This is almost a mimic of the trial that we would be doing with FDA. And then you have to do a lot of preclinical testing. This is dictated by its standards, ISO standards and other standards. And we have to do hundreds of tests here for the durability of the product and go through millions of cycles. And then you go through an IDE process to get the product approved to start clinical trials in US and pivotal trials. Where we are today is we spent almost a year and a half on this phase, definitive clinical trials, preclinical testing, and IDE. And by end of this year, we'll finish our IDE process. Next year, we'll start our IDE trials in the United States. And some 510K required, de novo 510K required clinical trials. And now we start worrying about the manufacturing scale up. And the last one is commercialization, but we're not going to talk much about this right now. And so coming back to innovation, what do we need to understand? Who is our customer during this phase? Investor, because we need next capital to go to the next phase. So how do we convince an investor that you really have the product and you really have a proof of principle, and you are on the right track and you have the right team? And as much is a customer is the ultimate consumer of the product. And then you go on to what is the focus during this time? Focus is R&D goals, align with the market needs, minimum viable product, again, keep thinking about it. And then the team, you need engineers, clinicians, regulatory, and I repeated clinicians, but I meant actually marketing people. You need marketing people telling what is the product that is needed in the marketplace, what is the product that salesmen can sell. You need that input at this phase, not later phase. Otherwise, you'll have an iteration. Milestones, proof of principle, that's the most important milestone. And through a product prototype. And here you have to have convincing evidence. For us, it was making this work on a bench and in a simulator and achieve the goals of this MVP. Then the capital, typically, everybody talked about it before me, and this 1 to 5 million. We spent about 4 million on this phase. But typically it is at least 4 million, and sometimes it is more than that. Sources for the capital are non-institutional, mostly angels, friends, and family. Rarely there are venture capital companies who would invest in very early stage companies. Then if you move on to the safety, here your customer is, once again, clinician and the patient, and investors again. And you have to worry about ethics committees because you're going into now testing in a human eye or a human body, and the focus is clinical outcomes. Are these clinical outcomes satisfactory? Is this what you intended? And is it meeting those clinical outcomes? That's the most important thing. Are the safety goals are there for the product? Is product reliable and is also stable? Those are the major questions you ask. Team, now you need a clinical regulatory team here. You need operating room experts if it's a phase 3 device. You need marketing people again, and you need quality assurance. Milestones, once again, are clinical validation, safety, and time. It takes 3 to 7 years. For us, it took approximately 4 years, this phase. And capital, 15 to 45 million. And, we spent approximately 30 plus million on this one. And the investors typically are institutional investors. And if you're not going through iterations, you can go through very quickly to this phase, regulatory phase. And here, of course, you have to deal with agencies, different regulatory bodies. And the focus is going to be regulatory approvals and the QA/QC manufacturing process. And team is going to be heavily clinical regulatory, CROs, and still marketing people and the manufacturing people, etc. Here, of course, the most important thing here is how do you contain costs in this phase? And one of the things I learned, most important thing here is how fast can you enroll the patients? And enrolling the patients is the most important. This is, most investigators promise you that, we can enroll patients, no problem. But in fact, because it is not in the normal flow of their practice, they kind of have good intentions, but their execution is poor. So you have to be there on the side and making sure this happens, because longer enrollments add to the cost. And so you really have to spend a lot of time on articulating enrollments. Of course, easiest thing to do is increase the number of sites. But that then increases the complexity, the management of sites by an order of magnitude. So there is a happy medium between how many sites you have, what is their ability to enroll, and how quickly can they enroll, and what kind of resources you got to put on these sites to make that happen. And so we spent a lot of time on this. And then the second decision you make here is how much of the work can you give it to a CRO, and then how much of the work do you want to do in-house. This is not a simple make or buy decision. It's a little bit more complex. You want to understand what are the factors in a clinical trial process that you want to control, and what are the processes that you can give it to a CRO, and they can do better with a lot of without a lot of supervision from you. So these are very critical decisions. You have to spend quite a bit of time on doing that. And so we are launching into this phase right now, and we expect this process to be 3 to 4 years. And in our case, we'll be implanting our lens in about 500 patients, and we'll be following those patients for 1 year. And so the cost for this phase really depend upon how many patients, how complex the surgery, and how long is the follow-up. And once again, and as I said, you need somewhere between 30 to 75 million, and we are raising about 60 million for this phase. And so moving on, what is the total cost? And so innovation phase, 5 million. These numbers, as you notice, are consistent with what Peter said, consistent with what Mark said. And our number is 4 million here. And what are the safety phase? And that's about 40 million is the average. And we're spending about 35 for this phase. And we're quite happy with that. And we did not have to go back and forth between these two phases at all, because we are very careful to minimize the iterations between the phases. Now we are entering into the regulatory phase. We need probably 50 million for this phase. And we are pretty sure we can accomplish this goal. Going on to the next slide here. And you may be curious a little bit about, how come, it costs so much money, and what is the cost of this last phase we talked about? There are simple rules here that we can use them. These are kind of like a back of the envelope calculations. It costs about approximately $15,000 per patient. And this is what I call cost at the site. This is what you pay for the investigators, investigator staff, and etc. And patients, sometimes you have to pay some patients too. And then there are, on top of this, a layer of CRO costs. And it depends upon, how much of this cost you shift between internal costs versus external costs. In our case, the role for the CRO is somewhat minimized. We want to have more control about this. So that's about $7,000 per patient. And then you have the whole slew of other costs. What the cost of monitoring not by the CRO, but we are using CRO to do the most of the monitoring. And the monitoring done by our own physicians for quality and also for integrity of the study, and investigator training, meetings, travel, safety, reading centers. There are a whole bunch of costs like this. There are costs for electronic data capture, data management, and all this. Those are all included there. That's about $9,000 per patient. And then on top of that, you have a one-time cost of buying capital equipment and putting them in the sites. That costs about $6,000 per site. And this varies from product to product, company to company, and the type of trial. Our cost is about $6,000. And these are sort of a maximum cost. We probably manage this cost much better than this. So total cost per patient is about $37,000. And so how do you calculate the cost of this phase, total phase of a clinical trial? Cost per patient multiplied by the total patients give you the data. In our case, this number is going to be approximately 20 million, with 500 patients, approximately 40,000. And then, so what is the capital raise? And the capital raise is 3 times that. So that's where this other 40 million is going to be spending internally on manufacturing or continued R&D. And we're going to be spending on internal staff on the regulatory, clinical, and quality and administration and everything else. So that's very easy way to calculate what the costs are.
Okay, Ram, I think we're about out of time. We're about out of time for you, I'm afraid. So you're
Okay, I'll leave this slide and I'll say this is the last slide anyway. And what I was going to say here is the numbers we arrived at versus these are the actual numbers, money raised by various companies in my space, and they are pretty close. Thanks.
very good. Thank you so much, Ram. There's a lot of fantastic information. The farther you got along in your presentation, the more super useful the data became. So thanks everybody who hung in there and hopefully got a ton of value. So I have a few questions for the speakers now. First of all, if I could get Mark and Peter to both turn on your screens and your microphones, and we'll get to some questions. So just to confirm, when you guys come on, please let me know that you're on. So maybe while I'm waiting for those guys, then Ron, I'll ask you one question. When you're assessing a market for size, volume, competitors, where would you look? Just quickly, what a couple of data sources you might look at.
The best market research is each specialty in medicine have market research firms. For example, in ophthalmology, there's a company called Market Scope. They generate volumes of data, and they generate every year, they generate market research reports. And in our case, we have done that. We also engage them to do a specific market research for us by polling about 20 to 25 cataract surgeons who do mostly premium IOL implantation. And we got a wealth of data from that. And a lot of interesting insight. We found out some of the insights we gained, even large strategics did not have it.
Great, thank you. So next I got a question for Peter. Can you tell us a little bit of what size of equity you would normally be taking from a company, or whatever the investment arithmetic for typical rounds for you? Peter, are you with us?
Yeah, not to be typical. I mean, it tends to be all over the board. Yeah, no, I've got mine on according to me.
Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead. So you don't have a typical?
Says I'm on.
Yes, you're on. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, perfect. And yeah, you know, we have companies in our portfolio that have taken 40 million. We have companies in our portfolio taken well over 100 million. You know, generally what happens over time is that management teams get diluted, but they also get re-upped. And so time goes on, we tend to ESOPs, and often the management team is significant owners because we're a partner to the management building those companies. So there really isn't a simple answer. It's all over the map. But typically what happens over time is the venture will be the largest shareholders in the company.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Great. So while we have you going here, Peter, so somebody had asked, what were 3 questions you always ask?
And maybe Scott, there was a question that I saw. I don't know if I can jump and answer it.
Go ahead, yeah.
3 questions that we always ask?
Yes.
Yeah. Look, so again, a question that just got answered. We really care about when you got your market data. How did you come to that conclusion that this is a market? How validated? We always ask, how much capital do you think it's going to take me from where you are today to a inflection point, and what are the milestones you're going to achieve along that? And then we ask always, who are the other people you're going to need on your team to help you execute this plan to value?
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, thank you. So, Mark, are you with us? No, I don't see Mark. So let's jump to another question. So,
Scott?
Mark, are you with us? No, Mark. Okay, that's just so much fun. So, Samuel M asks a question for Ram. The cost per patient seem really high. Is that just because it's U.S. and does the FDA require only U.S. sites? Can you comment on that?
Yes, it sounds high, but there are a lot of components to that. Typically, you have to pay the site itself for the surgery, and typically we have 1 year follow-up, and we are counting on 1 or 2 post-market follow-up visits as well. There are a lot of assessments to do on the quality of the vision and the quantity of the vision. So based on that, you simply add up all the assessment features you have to do. You have to do a test on OCT, you have to test on this machine, there's a safety test, etc. You add up all those costs from the bottom up, and then you come up with about $11,000, and for both eyes, because we implant on both eyes. And on top of that, now you're talking about additional. We have to pay patients, we have to pay reading centers, and etc. So it very quickly adds up.
Great, thank you. Okay.
I've done pharma studies, I've done various surgical products before. The numbers tends to be approximately there.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much. Okay, Mark, are you with us?
Yes.
Great.
Sorry, just rejoined.
Okay, so there was a question of roughly between the phases of development, what would you say the costs are, the ratios? And as a second follow-on to that, if you have to do multiple times around, say, an alpha, do they get less expensive with each term?
Mm-hmm. So a bulk of the development costs typically are going to be in StarFish Medical Phase 1, which is sort of alpha and beta development. Manufacturing transfer is going to be a smaller percentage thereof. It depends on how robust the manufacturing processes want it to be. And the difficult one to analyze, really without a bit more context, is what the costs are going to be for phase 0 development, because there's often some technology exploration. Assuming that's a mature device, and in general, if I were to provide some references, 1x, 5x, 0.5x.
Right, great. And if you have to take another crack at alpha, you go test it, you discover some issues, what would be the ratio of sort of the cost of doing it again?
Yeah, I guess that depends on how large the design changes are required and what technical issues were brought up through this. Back to Ram's point earlier, make sure that you aren't entering the next phase and then having to go back if you can, because it does get more expensive. But if you have to recycle, just from a product development perspective, a bulk of the design work will likely have been completed. I wouldn't think that the costs necessarily for the development portions of that are going to be high, but the regulatory testing may be the burdensome element to that. So
great. And sort of a related question, how can we make an early estimate of cost of goods sold? This question is from Ali T.
If you know the approximate bill of materials cost that exists within your device, just a summation of all the components at the volumes that you're looking for, without knowing how much assembly it is, if you just take that raw bill of materials cost and multiply that by 2, that's probably going to be close to the transferred costs that you would be realizing within your company. And then how much you charge your clients is part of the business envelope conversations that you need to have.
We would normally try to work with about 75% gross margin in other words, if your cost of goods was $1,000, you're paying for $2,000 out of manufacturing, you're probably going to sell it for about $8,000. That will allow you to have enough margin to be able to work with your international distribution partners and so on, and make a good deal with your exit. So, and if you're planning for much less than that, that may make the whole exit turn into that Tier Lab story that we read earlier. So. Okay, I'm going to do. I think I'm going to do one more question. So this is a question for Ram. In terms of where does early R&D belong? Is that in a company or in a university? Yeah.
It really depends upon how innovative your idea is, and how novel the idea is, and how much of a IP do you want to protect. So if you really want to protect the IP, I would try to do it inside the company as much as possible. And, however, often you see the aspect where people go to university and pick up an idea there and convert that into a product or something. And that's rarely, but I would, in my case, the idea started with my patent and my innovation. I was passionate about it, and I assembled a team that can actually do it and develop the product. And that's the way to do it. I prefer that pathway.
Great, thank you.
Compared to going to university and have them do the early R&D.
Sure.
I would just add as well the technology readiness level.
Okay, so just to round things off here, if you'd like to be informed about future events, and we'll get this technology hammered out a little better for the next one. Sorry about that. Thanks for everybody who hung on through all of the ups and downs of that. If you'd like a copy of any slides, we'll be emailing out everybody, and then you can respond directly to the speakers if you'd like a copy of their slides. We'll also be making a recording available once we tidy it up a little. If you'd like to be notified of future events, then you can sign up at our website or just let us know, and we'll make sure that you get our announcements so that you can sign up and to any sessions that interest you. So thanks again, everybody. It's been a total pleasure to have this session, and thank you particularly to our speakers, Peter van der Velden, Mark Durlick, and Ram Rao. Thanks again. See you next time.